What could make the MacBook Air even more perfect? Well, how about we make it bigger? Because bigger always means better, right? Well, does it? Let's find out. I've got a ton of comments from you all about a hypothetical MacBook Air, so let's tease that thread a little bit and see how one might take shape and what I would like to see if I were to make a perfect version of it. First off, if we're going to call something perfect, we probably need to define what perfect means, right? For my purposes, we're going to scope perfect around the laptop itself because the MacBook Air is a productivity slash student slash work machine, and it's not a gaming or major creation machine. Because of that, I'm going to call it perfect if it can last one whole day on a single battery charge, can be used in any situation because the screen is awesome, can transition between at the office mode and home office desktop setup mode, has enough power to not have beach balls or struggle with multiple browser tabs, and doesn't break the bank. Whew! Is that enough stuff? I feel like that's a lot of stuff to ask, but I don't feel like any of it is impossible with the current levels of tech that Apple has shown thus far. If we're going to design a bigger MacBook Air, we're going to need to totally redesign the body of said laptop. I've already kind of gave away what I think is the perfect size with the title, but I think a 15-inch Air style MacBook would fit perfectly into Apple's existing computer lineup. 16's probably too big and would take away from the 16-inch MacBook Pro. 17, well, that's just crazy. So 15, I think that's perfect. You'd still have the 13-inch Air, followed by the 13-inch Pro, then the 15-inch Air, which would then lead into the powerhouses of the Pros 14 and 16. Honestly, the main thing that increasing the size of the laptop would probably get us is just that bigger display. Throughout most of my life, I've never been that into getting the biggest display or the biggest tech possible, but as I get older, I do like being able to upscale text if need be, and having more usable workspace on a display just makes everything about using a computer easier. That's one of the things that I like most about the 16-inch MacBook Pro is just how much of a full-on computer experience you get no matter where you take it, because the screen is large enough that it's essentially like having an external monitor with you. It's awesome. So we'd get the bigger body with the bigger display. I think that display would at the very least need to be the same contrast quality of the MacBook Pros, because one of the things we're going to have to do today is we're going to have to play a very delicate dance of features and price as we build this thing out. If we pack it full of a bunch of top-of-the-line tech options and it costs $3,000, I think we're probably defeating the purpose. So give us a 500 nit brightness panel, give us some decent contrast, and I think we could call it good for the display. I don't think we'd be able to afford from a product budget standpoint the ProMotion technology or like the high refresh rate of the other MacBook Pros. We mentioned this in the perfect M2 MacBook Air standard from a few days ago, but I would also want to see the new 1080p web camera brought over here. It's not the best web camera that I've ever seen in my life, but it's infinitely better than the 720p potato cam that Apple has used previously. So toss it in. And if you've got a notches, go ahead. Go ahead, Apple, notches if we need to get that to happen. Probably going to catch some flack for this, but after several months of use, the MacBook notch has turned into the iPhone notch for me. I only notice it when somebody points it out. Now, when we look at the rest of the body, I really like how the current MacBook Air is laid out. So essentially just do this, but wider. For comparison, I think we can look at how the MacBook Pro 14 and 16 differ from each other. I mean, they both have essentially the same physical design, just do the same thing, but bigger in the MacBook Air. The only thing I think we'll need to worry about here is making it too thin overall. We certainly don't want to have a bend-gate controversy because the materials are spread too thin, leading to a poor structural design. I think we all remember how those older iPads turned out. So I think the current thickness of the Air is fine for this bigger laptop. I do want the 13-inch model to get as thin as possible, but I feel like you have less leeway the bigger the laptop gets. But keep that wedge-shaped design. The more I use my MacBook Pro 14, the more I dislike the typing experience. The keys are great and the keyboard is great, but my preferred height of office chair and typing stance, do people have typing stances, or is that just me? Like, I'm ready for my typing stance. But my typing stance makes working from the MacBook itself fairly uncomfortable after a certain period of time. And I don't have that same issue with the MacBook Air, so please keep it angled and keep me happy. Since we are making the body of the laptop bigger, I think it's obvious that we'll also be increasing the size and quality of the speakers. Team, let me tell you, you will never hear me claim to be an audiophile or even to understand a lot of the technical jargon and things that go into quality audio. But what I can say is the 16-inch MacBook Pro, both the Intel and M1 version, have the best speakers that I've ever heard from a laptop. We might not be able to fit in the exact sound system into a 15-inch MacBook Air, but darn it, Apple, I want to see you do your best to fit in that exact same thing. You do your best. You got to do it. See, the two things that we are really gaining by having a bigger laptop are the bigger screen and the better speakers. You've already knocked it out of the park with the MacBook Pro and the M1 iMac. Challenge yourselves to top both of those with this laptop that doesn't exist and we're just like having fun with. The only other things that I would like to see physically on the 15-inch MacBook Air are the port selection. Because it's an Air, I don't want it to have to be any bigger than it has to, so I'm fine with keeping it with just Thunderbolt ports. We don't need HDMI, we don't need SD cards, we don't need fancy things. However, because it's bigger, I think that means a bigger number of ports. We can make this the most Thunderbolted 4 laptop that Apple makes by putting 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports on this machine. Thunderbolted. Whew. 2 on each side, and for good measure, throw in the headphone jack. Okay, I'll leave it. This is a two-way street, right? So I'll leave it up to you, Apple, if you want to include MagSafe charging on here. But being honest, as much as I liked MagSafe back when it first came out, and the first time I had it went like 2017, I don't think I've ever really used it on either my MacBook Pro 14 or 16. USB-C power providing monitors make this feature almost obsolete, and it's kind of more of a novelty than anything else. But none of this stuff works without what's going on internally to the MacBook. Before we jump headlong into the internal components, let's start off with a hybrid section. I think we've set the baseline that the new Apple M1 MacBook Airs will not have an active cooling system because their chips are efficient and run cool enough that you don't really need one, and darn it, I want to keep that going in this hypothetical bigger version. In fact, this should have an even easier time staying cool because the chassis will have more space to disperse that heat. Spoilers a little bit for the processor discussion here in a second, but I'm not going to recommend or advocate for the M1 Max inside of this thing. I think with what we've seen from the M2 or M1 standard options, the smaller MacBook Air can mitigate the heat without having thermal problems, and I would imagine if we could put in a bigger heatsink, and because it's a bigger laptop, that would do even better. But I'm a software product manager and not a hardware product manager, so maybe that doesn't make sense in the actual physical world, but in the fictional world in which a 15-inch MacBook Air exists, so does that logic. And I'm like 85% sure that that sentence made sense. Moving on to the processor, I think to make this MacBook work, we would need to wait for whatever the M2 turns into. Mainly because if we wanted to have more ports and be able to use this in both a travel and home office situation, the M1 chips limit us to a single external display, which is fine for me, but sucks for a lot of folks. We still don't exactly know what the M2 or whatever they're going to call it is going to be capable of, but I would imagine that after we've seen the display abilities grow with the M1 Pro and M1 Max, that any Apple chip from now on would give us at least 2 6K displays out. I could be wrong in that assumption, but again, in this fictional world we've created here on YouTube, it would work out the way that we wanted it to. Right? I mean, why have a fictional world if you can't dictate what happens inside of it? So because we get the M2 chip with whatever power it comes with, which will be more than enough because the M1 chip is more than enough, we get access to Thunderbolt 4 and the Wall-O monitors that we all grew up wanting. It's hard to talk about power on a computer like this because in reality, how much power do you need? Those of us working day-to-day in offices are probably getting everything done already with like a 5-year-old Intel i5 laptop. So power for power's sake isn't something that's all that important. What I would like to see is maybe a forking of the processor design in the MacBooks. Keep the low efficiency core count, high power core count around for the MacBook Pros, iMac Pros, Mac Pros, whatever Pros computer lineup Apple comes out with, because those obviously will need to be sold on how they make the bar charts go up. But I think the standard computers, the minis, the Airs, the 13-inch Pros, etc., I think those should move towards a more efficient design of maybe more than 4 cores of efficiency. So they'll give us roughly the same amount of base power, but do that for even longer during day-to-day tasks. When I'm using my M1 Max MacBook, I only use the processor for like 5 minutes a day I needed to render my YouTube videos. Besides that, all the rest of it is excess. So if we can lay out the 2 paths for the development of the Apple processors, I think that will help folks know what they are getting into with both styles of computers. Long story long, I just want the M2 to be more efficient with its power use because this bigger MacBook Air would have physically more space for a bigger battery. Team, this is the part of the video that I'm most excited about, and I've wanted to get right here because imagine this. Imagine a MacBook with the power consumption of the MacBook Air, but a battery the size of the MacBook Pro 16. I honestly think a computer like that could go into 30 hours of usable power. Like, that's a computer that would really only need to be charged once a week. Also, it should go without saying that the MacBook Air would be able to still have its full power when not plugged into a wall, because all MacBooks are like that. Yes, I just kind of wanted to kick the Windows laptops down a little bit where I could in a video where I don't talk about them. Take take that. Just the thought of that total insanity extended battery life makes me excited, because while the MacBook Air is great, it does struggle sometimes if I'm doing 2 full days back to back and I forget to charge it when I get home. Ask me, right? Ask me how I know of that pain. And the very last thing we need to talk about is, how much is the darn thing going to cost? When we lay out how the laptop will be priced, I think keeping it on the upgrade path of the current MacBook Air makes the most amount of sense. We give it a lower end GPU core count option and a higher core count option one. Give it up to 32 gigabytes of unified memory, and because it's bigger, let's also do a 4 terabyte solid state drive. I think a base model price of $1599 for 8 gigabytes of unified memory and a 512 gigabyte solid state drive, I think that's a really good and reasonable starting point for this new revolutionary laptop. And then we could do the normal Apple upgrade path where the top of the line ends up costing like $3,000. Seriously, I mainly always buy the base models. But what about you? What would you like to see out of a larger MacBook Air? Let me know in the comments below, because maybe it should have been a 17-inch MacBook Air. I just want to hear what you all would design if you had your king for the day. Let me know how you would make this. And if you like this video, but you need a real laptop now, here's my video laying out why you should strongly consider the 14-inch MacBook Pro, because spoilers, it's amazing. You can find that video by clicking right here. Click, 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 click. Thanks for watching.